Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So this week we are working on essay 2. Very similar to how we spent week 5 back when we were putting together our narrative. So now we're focused on the process analysis, and I would really like us to spend the entire week putting together our essays. I would like us to go through all the steps of the writing process, and it might be especially valuable to think about the writing process right now because we are working with processes. We are analyzing processes, and hopefully we saw last time that if we actually break the writing of essay 2 down into multiple steps, individual elements, it is a little bit easier to produce a good paper. So I just wanted to talk a little bit today about pre-writing, getting started on the assignment. I thought we could take a quick look at the outline that I posted in the week 8 module. You guys might not necessarily be outlining here at the beginning of the week as I'm recording this, but if you're watching this a little bit later in the week, or if you come back to it, it would be great to outline somewhere around the middle of the week if you're not doing it earlier, and then you can be drafting by the end of the work week. And as always, you can always I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you guys with essay 1, but you're always free to send me a rough draft. I think I mentioned this, but I'm not 100% sure. You can always send me a rough draft of your essay, but I need it by 5 p.m. on the Friday before it's due. A couple of you, I think, did that for essay 1, and it's always an option for any of these major essays. But I just think as a general rule, it's good if you have a rough draft at least mostly finished by Friday, by the Friday of a work week like this, so that you have some time for post-writing. We don't want to be drafting all the way up to 11:30 on Sunday night. We want to leave ourselves some time for the final stage of the writing process, and that is, of course, post-writing. That means revision and editing. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, we've already gone through all of this stuff, so I just wanted to go through it again very quickly, just a reminder to get started with some of that early idea generation stuff that we talked about with essay 1. The processes stay the same, but the things that you're writing down will change from essay to essay, obviously. So with the narrative, you were just jotting down some early ideas about your plot, maybe about your key themes, settings, characters, all the key narrative elements that you knew you were eventually going to need to include in the essay. So now that we're doing a process analysis, you can still do some free writing, some basic brainstorming, just get some ideas down on paper in whatever way works best for you. But now, instead of writing down all of those narrative elements, you need to think about your process. You need to think about what you're trying to say about your process, but also all of those individual elements and individual parts that make up the process. Just like you had to come up with all of your narrative events and then the sequence of those narrative events, it's similar now. You need to identify all of the different parts, all of the different elements, figure out what you need to talk about, what their relationships are, and then you need to put them in some kind of a sequence, some kind of an organizational structure. So it's similar work, but just different subject matter. Instead of narratives, now we're looking at processes, and there's a lot of different processes out there for you to choose from. So obviously, part 1, step 1, as you get started on the essay this week, is to think about what process you want to choose. What is going to be your subject of analysis? Pick something that you know well. There is no research component to this paper. I don't want you guys consulting outside sources because with an essay like this, it can be very easy to lean heavily on those outside sources because we can get a lot of step-by-step instructions from any number of places. So that's a slippery slope. I want us to stay away from sources and just talk about these processes based on our own knowledge, based on our own experience. So that means the process needs to be something that you are very comfortable with, something that you have maybe done yourself, or something that you've at least watched others do, perhaps. Maybe you've read about it, studied it. But the best process analyses really are based on things that the writer does or maybe even wants to do, but something that you know about, something that you do have some experience with, because you're not going to be able to consult sources, so you need to draw from your own knowledge, your own experience. So choose something good. Remember another thing, I know it might be tempting to choose a very simple process because you figure, well, this won't be hard to write about. But remember, our length requirement for Essay 2 is the same as it was for Essay 1. So 3 to 4 pages. You need to have at least 3 pages, 3 full pages at minimum. So if you pick a really simple process like making a PB&J, maybe you can get 3 pages out of that, but it could be a challenge. You might run out of content, frankly. You're just going to run out of things to say, run out of things to do. So you need to pick a relatively complex process. I don't mean complex in the sense that it's difficult to understand. I just mean complex in that it has a lot of different parts. It has a lot of different steps, different elements that you can explore, and something that you can actually make interesting observations about and deliver an interesting conclusion. Because remember what we were talking about with analysis back when we first started this unit. The major goal for analysis is to provide something to your audience. You're giving them some of your knowledge, some of your understanding. You're arriving at an original conclusion about your subject of analysis, and then you're sharing that conclusion with your readers, operating on the assumption that that conclusion is going to help them or allow them to complete the process or at least understand the process better. So keep that in mind. You need to have a process that people might actually be interested in reading about, and a process that is valuable or important in some way. But once you've selected your process, go ahead and get started on the idea generation. Just get some stuff on paper, break it down. Remember what analysis really is. To analyze something, if we're going back to the ancient Greek word, to analyze something really means to break it down, to take it apart in order to examine all of its individual elements. So you need to do that yourself while you're pre-writing. That's kind of how you get started. Break down your process, figure out how many steps are involved, how many different parts, and then start kind of arranging a loose framework. You might want to get it down on paper. You might just sort of have it in your mind, but you need to think about how you're going to approach this process. Obviously, you need to know all the different parts that go into it, and then eventually you'll need to figure out that sequence as well. But just start getting ideas down on paper. It's very informal, and that's really what you need to spend your first day or the first half of the first day that you're working on this essay. Do some of that basic pre-writing stuff, the early pre-writing stuff first. Don't skip it. Because you need some ideas down on paper, and once you do that, you can start getting ready for an outline. Now, if this is a process that you haven't done in a while, or maybe ever, it would not be a bad idea to do a little test run to practice it, to get refamiliarize yourself with it as you're getting started as well. That's something that you can do sort of alongside those early idea generation activities. And then you can move on to the outline. So I would like us to go over the outline that I posted. Just like we said with Essay 1, you don't have to follow my outline necessarily word for word. I'm just giving you an idea of how you need to get organized. And I'm giving you a lot of freedom when it comes to the body paragraphs and how you put those together. I'm just telling you the basic things that you need to include in those bodies and the basic things that you need to include in the intro and concluding paragraphs as well. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. But first, I just wanted to mention something else that I posted this week. Actually, I posted it last week, but forgot to talk about it in lecture, didn't say anything about it, so I assumed a lot of you probably did not look at it. So it's there again this week. It's in the week 8 module, and now I just want to mention it briefly. It's just a brief excerpt from a student paper. I took this from a textbook. This is an example of a process analysis written by a student. But what I wanted to show you guys, and sort of a big idea that we need to grasp this week, is we are putting together the two different styles of process analysis. So remember last week I told you we have what's often called directional or directive process analysis, and that really just means instructions, step-by-step directions. And then on the other side we have what's often called informational or explanatory process analysis. And those still often include steps and sort of directions, but they're not so much designed to allow the reader to complete the process being described. So you remember the two examples we looked at last week. The coffee example was directive. You could follow all of those steps and actually, make the coffee. But the other one we watched about the bill, how a bill becomes a law, that's more informational because a typical viewer is not going to be able to actually complete that entire process by themselves. So the whole point of the informational process analysis was to simply allow readers to better understand the process, to understand all that goes into it, how it works, and how it concludes. So we're going to be combining those two styles because just doing one might not give us quite enough to do. And I know it's tempting to pick the directive style because it's kind of easy to do step-by-step instructions. If any of you guys did the paper airplane activity that I mentioned last week, you've already seen that. And like we also said last week, if you've ever read instructions, if you've ever put anything together that you purchased, from a store, you already know that style, that type of process analysis. And it's pretty straightforward, and there's not always a whole lot of text. So we can incorporate aspects of that, but we're also going to bring in more information, more explanation. So that's why I wanted to post this PDF, because the student here is doing exactly that. He is providing step-by-step instructions, but for each step, he's giving us a lot of information, a lot of explanation, and he's really combining the two approaches. So it doesn't really matter what the subject matter is here. It's about poetry, writing poetry. That's his subject of analysis, how to become a poet. So really poetry, but specifically how to write poetry. That's the process that he's exploring here. So we don't need to worry too much about all of his content, and we don't even need to read this thing word for word. I just wanted you guys to look at it because the textbook I took it from, they've annotated and sort of made these notes for you so you can track all the different things that the student is doing here. And I just want to call your attention to his intro paragraph, his thesis statement, all of that's labeled, but also look at how he organizes his process. So he does something that a lot of us need to do. And if you actually look at the top of page 260, that at the very top of the first page, it's only one page on our viewer, but it's 2 pages from a textbook. If you look at the top, you'll see an outline, a really good outline that he's done. And even though we can't see this entire essay, I lost the second page. I don't know where it is. So the essay goes on, but we can't see the end of it. But we can see the outline. So we see his organizational structure. And it's a very good one. So he's showing us that he has 3 different stages of this process. 3 big stages. The first one is developing habits, I think. Yeah, stage 1 is developing the habits of a poet. Okay, stage 2 is defeating writer's block, And then stage 3 is actually writing the poems. So those are the 3 big stages that he's going to cover, much like there are 3 big stages in the writing process: pre-writing, drafting, and post-writing, as we know. But look, he's getting a little more complex. He's getting a little bit more specific as well, because within each stage, there are individual steps, individual elements that he's going to explore. That's also very much like the writing process, because we know within pre-writing, there are several different things we can do. We do the early idea generation that I was just talking about. We also outline. We also do a draft of our thesis, and we try to get organized in terms of our schedule, making a work schedule. So that's all part of pre-writing, but those are all individual steps within the larger stage. So he's planning all of this out. Underneath that first stage, he has like some smaller bullet points or numbers for the individual elements or parts that he's going to explore. And he does that for each stage. So stage 2, defeating writer's block, we have 2 kind of parts to that. Understanding where it comes from, and then just writing, which seems a little silly, but whatever. I mean, he's breaking it down into 2 parts, 2 steps. And then with the third stage, that's actually more elaborate. It's a shame that we can't see it. We don't actually see the third stage because that's on the next page that I lost. But notice on the outline, stage 3 is the actual writing of the poems. So this looks like the stage that he has the most to say about, because look at how many individual parts he's planning to mention. At least 5 there in the outline. That's far more than what we saw in stage 1 or stage 2. So he has a lot of individual parts to explore in stage 3. We don't see him actually doing it, but we know that he is going to do it. So if you look at some of his body paragraphs, beginning at the very bottom of that first page, you'll see that he's using topic sentences, just like I do in my outline. So the topic sentence simply announces what that paragraph is going to be about. So he's announcing the first stage as he gets into that in the first body. And then in his next body, I think he's getting more specific, and he's getting into the individual parts of the stage. So if you track the bodies, that's sort of what he's doing. Some bodies are mostly devoted to the big stage, and then he'll have other bodies where he's getting into individual parts or elements. So we can have a pretty complex organizational structure here. You know, you have your big stages, and then each stage has the individual steps. So as you're planning, as you're doing pre-writing, do what he's done. Start getting a sense of how you're going to arrange all of this. If you have 2 or 3 big stages or parts, make sure you're identifying all the smaller parts within them, assuming they have some, and then you can kind of follow this student's lead. Your outline can look a lot like his, so you know your stages, your big stages, and your smaller parts. Once you have all of that written down, you can start figuring out how you want to arrange your body paragraphs. But yeah, after he's introduced that first stage, which is all about habits, in the next body on the top of page 261, he starts talking about the first habit. Then in the next body, he's talking about the second habit. So really, he spent a total of 3 body paragraphs on just the first stage. 1 body introducing the stage, and then 1 body for each part of that stage. Now, he doesn't necessarily do that for each stage. I think he moves through the second stage maybe a little bit faster. But no, he spends multiple paragraphs on that one too, because again, we're not even seeing stage 3 yet. So he has a total of 6 body paragraphs here, I believe. And obviously we don't see a conclusion, but he does have one. I think there's 6 bodies that we can see. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 6 bodies But there's more that we can't see. He has an intro. We can see how he's moving through his process, and we can just get a sense of how he's combining the two approaches, because look, he's identifying steps, he's identifying parts, but that's not all he's doing. He sort of announces the parts, and then he spends time providing detail. That's the informational side. Providing the parts in a list, that's easy. That's your outline. That's an instruction manual. That's not quite what we want. That's not at all what we want for Essay 2. We want the steps combined with plenty of detail, explanation, examples, and whatever else your audience needs. And that's what he's doing. Look at how well developed his body paragraphs are. Some of them are fairly short, but he is combining the directional with the informational. And that's what we want to do too. So again, don't feel like you have to read this. You're not responsible for knowing what his essay is about. Just look at it. Look at the structure. Look at his outline. Look at how he's getting organized. It's a good example to follow. All right, so let's just wrap up by looking a little bit at our outline. You might prefer his, I don't know. Mine's a little bit more open-ended because I don't know exactly the nature of all of your processes. So I'm really just reminding you of some key things about the intro paragraph, about your body paragraphs, and of course about the conclusion. So just remember to do some basic things in the intro. You obviously need to introduce your subject of analysis. Don't forget to do that. And don't assume that I'm immediately going to know what it is. Some are very obvious and recognizable, but if your process is a little bit weird or just kind of off the beaten path or something that not everybody knows about, you need to take your time and explain some things up front. First, just introduce it. Tell us what it is. What process have you chosen? Be very clear with your language, and then decide if you need to give us background info. Like, am I going to understand what you're saying, or do you need a couple of additional sentences to sort of give me some context or give me a little bit more explanation about what this process is? But if it's relatively simple, that's fine. You might not have to do anything after that first introductory sentence. But get us into the process, and remember, we still need some kind of a hook. It's not going to be the same as the opening hook in a narrative, but you need to grab our interest. You need to get our attention somehow by introducing your subject. Then give us whatever background info you think is necessary. That's a judgment call. That might be one sentence. That might be 3 or 4 sentences. It's just up to you and what you think is necessary. And then establish your thesis. You need to think of these as somewhat argumentative, these essays. I mean, it might seem weird, but we are making an argument about our process. We're making a larger point about the process. And most importantly, we're trying to show our audience why this process matters. Why is this process important? Why should your audience be interested? Why should your audience even want to know more about this process? Or why should they want to complete this process themselves? You need to provide some of those reasons. That needs to be a part of the argument that you're making. Here's my process. And here's why it matters. Here's why you need to do this. Or here's why you need to at least understand this. Make a case. Try to present that to your readers with a strong thesis that comes near the end, or maybe at the very end of your intro paragraph. So once you check those boxes, you can start focusing on the bodies. So I'm just giving you a broad range here. I say 3 to 8 bodies. And I'm just telling you the basic things you need to do. Give us a topic sentence at the beginning of each body. There's no one right way to create a topic sentence. Just write them based on your own style and your own content. But remember the goal. You're just trying to make us understand what the paragraph's going to be about. So often your topic sentence will be announcing the stage or the step, the individual element that we're going to be exploring in that particular paragraph. Again, look at the example in that PDF. That's what the student is doing. At the beginning of some bodies, he's announcing that big stage, stage 1, stage 2. And then in other bodies, as we saw, he's getting into the individual parts of those stages. He's getting more specific, a little bit more minute. He's getting into the individual parts. So again, if we're still thinking about like our mechanical metaphors from our first week, he's really getting into the smaller parts in some of those other bodies, and then he moves on to the next big stage, and then he gets into the smaller parts of that stage. So you got to figure out, okay, what is this body going to be doing? Like, what am I talking about in this body? And figure out, once you got your sequence in mind, you can really start planning all of these bodies, right? And you can just follow your sequence like he's doing. Stage 1, the different parts of stage 1, stage 2, etc., etc. But again, you might not really have stages. You might just have a bunch of parts. Everybody's sequence is a little bit different. You might have a bunch of ingredients. You might be describing physical actions, which means you're not really working with, mechanical pieces or, objects so much as your individual parts will be the movements that the reader is supposed to be making. So whatever it is, you need to devote the proper amount of time to all of your elements, all of the parts, everything that you need to cover in order for us to understand this process. So again, the way to make sure that you get everything done is to do a good job of planning your bodies. Just go through that process, figure out what you're going to be talking about in each body. And once you have an idea, jot down a sort of rough sketch of your topic sentence. You can work on it. It might be a little rough. It might not appear in quite that same form when you actually write the essay, but get an idea of how you're going to announce the topic of each body paragraph. And that'll help you when it's time to start drafting. The other things to remember with bodies is, again, we're combining the instructional or directional, I keep using different words, but directional, I think, or directive were the terms we used initially. We're combining the directive with the informational. So just remember that you want to, just double check, plan for both, and then later double check to make sure you're providing both. And as I say in the outline, some of the paragraphs that you plan and write, they might contain both of these approaches. You might have steps and a lot of information for those steps. But that's not the only way to organize. I've seen some process analyses, especially ones that are about really complex, sort of multifaceted processes. In some cases, we might devote a short body paragraph to just explaining the step. Like, this step is kind of weird. There's multiple parts to the step, maybe, or maybe the step just takes a long time, and we need 3 or 4 sentences just to describe the step. And then that might be a short body all by itself, and then the next body could be additional explanation, examples, follow-up, more of the informational aspect. So we can sometimes separate directional from informational. We can have some directional bodies, and then we can have some informational bodies. But more typically, and I think what we see in a lot of our examples, more typically we're going to combine both in the same bodies. We don't necessarily have to. Again, it's a judgment call. It should be based on, again, the complexity of your individual steps and parts. If they just need to be identified and then you can immediately get into more informational stuff, then yeah, you can combine the two in the same body paragraphs. But like I said, for things like for steps or actions or parts that really are a little complex, you might want to separate the directional from the informational, but make sure, there's not a gap between them. You want the informational to come right after the directional if you are going to separate them. You still want to have clear links, clear transitions, so readers can follow everything in a smooth, clear sequence. So again, use my outline to sort of guide you. Oh yeah, and the conclusion, really just 2 boxes to check. Make sure that you are restating your thesis. Use different words, different phrasing, but express the same basic ideas. And this is also your final chance to really drive home the overall significance of your process. Remind us again, even if you've already kind of stated this in your intro, remind us again why this process matters. Remind us again why it might help us. What can we get out of it as readers? Why should we care about it? That's your final chance to drive home all of that. So at minimum, you're going to have an intro, a conclusion, and 3 bodies if you want to stick with that kind of old 5-paragraph model that most of us are familiar with from previous English classes. I told you with the narrative, that's kind of the bare minimum that you can get away with, and that's also true here. 5 paragraphs total really would be the bare minimum. I think for maximum efficiency, for maximum effect, I think you need probably more. Most of you will need more than 3 bodies, but you probably don't want to go beyond 8 because then the paper is probably too long for our purposes. So let's try to stay within my range. 3 at the bare minimum, 8 on the high side. A lot of people end up with 5, 6. I mean, this student obviously has a lot. I don't know how long he takes on the 3rd stage, but even just what we see here can sort of be a good place for us to at least start. As far as length or just number of bodies, I don't know what this would translate to in a Word doc. It's hard to tell, but 5 or 6 bodies would be good. Some will be longer than others. But remember, 3 pages is the minimum length requirement. That's not a lot in a double-spaced document. So make sure you meet the requirements. Make sure you're reading my directions. Use my outline as much as you need to. Hopefully it's helpful. And let me know if you have any questions. And again, send me a rough draft if you want feedback. I just need it by 5 p.m. On the Friday of this week. Good luck, and I'll see you next time.